The subcommittee will come to order. We are really lucky to have three incredible witnesses today to talk about a very important topic, military innovation, and how we can learn from the lessons of the past. The ranking member will forgive me if I've already told this story, but it always is in my mind, which is there's this famous scene in William Manchester's biography of MacArthur. No offense, Dr. Herman, I know you wrote a MacArthur book too. That was great. But in the Manchester book, there's this scene where he's in the Philippines prior to World War II, and he's having this debate with his staffers about, whether in the midst of war one should suspend democracy. And it becomes this debate about whether dictatorships or democracies are better. And MacArthur, maybe against sort of the caricature of him, argued for democracy and said that, the dictator may start off well, but once they encounter friction, they slow down, whereas democracies start slowly, but they activate thousands of flexible and free-thinking minds, and over time ultimately prevail. And I think this is the story we tend to tell ourselves as how America wins and does crisis management. Perhaps in some sense this is the story of Freedom's Forge. I wonder, though, if there are not two problems with that story, or whether what I call the MacArthur curve is fundamentally broken when we think about innovation. The first is that in light of the most stressing national security challenge we're trying to solve, which is a PLA invasion of Taiwan, we might not have time to turn, car factories into bomber factories. If they pursue a rapid fait accompli strategy, we may not have time to activate Freedom's Forge. And the second thing is, and perhaps more obviously, is that the defense industrial base and the defense innovation base looks much different than it did at that period of time. We've discovered many single points of failure. Right now, I think the war in Ukraine has revealed the brittleness of our munitions industrial base, and the list goes on and on. So today, I hope, if nothing else, our incredibly impressive witnesses can help us sort of learn the right lessons from past cases of military innovation, or even the right lessons from cases where powers failed to innovate and what that meant for their geopolitical position. And as I said at the start, I can't think of three better people to help us think through that. Oh, one other final note. I think the tendency when you go to one of these defense conferences is, there's always like a bunch of panels on the new shiny thing, right? It's AI, it's quantum, it's JADC2, but in light of that, that's all well and good, but I think in light of that, it's incredibly important that we have a conversation like this about looking backward with an eye to preparing ourselves for the future. Because while the sort of essence or nature of war does not change, its character does seem to be changing in light of new technology. So I want to thank Dr. Andrew Krepinevich, who is the author of a great new book called The Origins of Victory, many other books, including a book on Marshall and a great study on archipelagic defense. The 2.0 version was just released in September. And then, of course, Dr. Arthur Herman, who, as I alluded to, not only wrote a book on a great Wisconsinite, Douglas MacArthur, but one of my favorite books, Freedom's Forge, has written more books than I have time to list. And then Colonel Mark Gunzinger, who has too many titles to list, and wrote the Department of Defense's first transformation strategy. So we have a wealth of knowledge here in front of us, and we're really looking forward to this discussion. With that, I yield to the ranking member.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening these experts on disruptive innovation and ensuring that our military remains the most innovative in the world. As a representative from Silicon Valley, I can attest that the most disruptive innovations of the past 50 years have come from the Department of Defense. I mean, it is DARPA's innovations and others in GPS, in the internet, in drones that really led to the commercialization of these technologies in Silicon Valley. So the idea that our Department of Defense and military have not been innovative is just historically inaccurate. They've been incredibly innovative. But now that we see so much disruptive innovation taking place in the commercial sector, we need a strategy to make sure that the Department of Defense remains the most innovative. and also that these technologies are accurately and fully deployed for us in the case of war or combat. And so I appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chairman, on trying to ensure that we integrate and adopt these technologies and use them to make sure that we remain the world's strongest, most innovative military. And I'm looking forward to hearing the experts' testimony.
Thank you to the ranking member. Your written testimony, all three of your written testimony is exceptional. I recognize it's unfair for us to ask you to summarize it in 5 minutes, which is not a lot of time. The good news is we will have plenty of time for multiple rounds of questions, and the ranking member loves it when I entertain multiple rounds of questions. With that, we will start with you, Dr. Krepinevich.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Khanna, members of the subcommittee. By way of background, let me start out by saying I agree with both of you. We're in a period of disruptive change in terms of the military competition, and it demands disruptive innovation, as you mentioned, Ranking Member Khanna. In terms of disruptive change, we are looking at really a geopolitical change that has put us into a period of great power competition that's been absent for about 30 years. But also, in particular, the Chinese have caught up to us in what the U.S. military sometimes refers to as precision warfare. We've lost our monopoly, if you will, in the ability to do precision kind of operations of the kind that we demonstrated in the 2 Gulf Wars and in various unconventional warfare operations. The second aspect of disruptive change is the broad advance of military-related technologies. Everything from additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence, drones, quantum computing, directed energy, and so on. That's offering militaries the opportunity to operate in very different and far more effective ways. And historically speaking, typically the military that figures out how to do that first enjoys an enormous advantage over its rivals. And so one question is, how well is the U.S. military prepared and positioned to engage and pursue in disruptive innovation? And to answer this question, as Congressman Gallagher mentioned, Chairman Gallagher, the book that I wrote looks at the histories of 4 militaries in the industrial information age that engaged in disruptive innovation. They were the first to do so, and they realized enormous benefits in adapting and transitioning to a new way of warfare. And fortunately, when I looked at these 4 militaries, otherwise there would not have been much of a book, they do demonstrate some common characteristics. So you can sort of look at a military and look at these characteristics and say, how well are they positioned to undertake disruptive innovation? And I'll briefly summarize some of these characteristics. One is a guiding vision. What is the new vision of warfare? After we get through this transition period, what dominates warfare? What are its new characteristics? Oh, I should mention that the 4 militaries were the Royal Navy in the first decade of the 20th century, the transition to the so-called dreadnought revolution, submarines, and so on. The German development of blitzkrieg warfare in the period between the world wars. The American Navy's shift from a battleship-based Navy to a carrier-based Navy between the world wars. And the transformation of the American Air Force between the Vietnam War and the first Gulf War, where they introduced what the Russians called a reconnaissance strike complex. So getting back to the characteristics, one is that guiding vision. Second is identifying the key operational challenges that a military confronts. You can align or sort of look at this as a diagnosis. What are the problems we're trying to solve? What are the key threats? Since we only have limited resources, we have to be very careful about what we choose to focus our efforts on. Next would be developing an operational concept. How do we plan to address these new challenges? Then there's changes in measures of effectiveness. What worked before, what we valued before, probably we're not going to value in the same set of priorities now as we did before we engaged in our innovation efforts. Then there's exercises at the operational level of war. And the point here is we're not going to be sure whether our new way of war is valid. And so we conduct operational exercises to try and reduce uncertainty as much as we can wherever we can. There's extended tenure. Some of the key military leaders that guide this effort serve for extended periods of time, because typically disruptive innovation takes a decade or more, and yet a lot of senior military leaders typically last 2 or 3 or 4 years in an assignment. This does not occur in periods of disruptive innovation in the 4 cases that I studied. Then there's the issue of time-based competition. If you have a military that's world-class at time-based competition that can adapt quickly, they can pursue what I call the first and second move advantages, but they can also adapt very readily and much more quickly than their rivals. And this turns out to be quite an important factor. This concludes my remarks, Mr. Chairman, although I will say one final point. If we're thinking about 2 things with respect to disruptive innovation, one is we have to get the operational concept. If we're looking at the Chinese as a threat, the operational, how do we plan to defend the first island chain? That's the critical operational challenge. And second, we know we're going to be wrong because there's so many variables. And so if we ever go to war with China, how quickly can we adapt in order to be able to sustain not only the operations, but also adapt to reduce the flaws and eliminate the flaws that our concept is revealed, is revealed in our concept in conflict. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Herman, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Is your microphone on? On. Make sure it's close to your mouth. Sorry, very formal here, very far away.
All set to go?
I think so, yep.
Great. Our defense industrial base is in crisis. This is certainly the conclusion that our first ever National Defense Industrial Strategy Report has just reached. According to its most recent draft, that industrial base, quote, does not possess the capacity, capability, responsiveness, or resilience required to satisfy the full range of military production needs at speed and scale. What some of us have been warning about for a decade is now apparent to everyone. One reason I wrote my book, Freedom's Forge, more than 10 years ago, was to call attention to structural deficiencies in how we arm and equip our military compared to World War II and the Cold War. Now, thanks to the war in Ukraine, the problem has been made obvious and urgent. The question is how to better incorporate the innovations taking place in our private sector, from AI and robotics to cyber and quantum, into our defense industrial base. Now, the industrial base consists of many things: production facilities, supply chains, research and development of new technologies and systems like AI and quantum, hypersonics, UAVs, industrial and cyber security, and workforce. And we urgently need a strategy for incorporating innovation in all of these areas as part of an overall national security strategy. But the role of innovation, I think, is misunderstood. It shouldn't be treated as if it were a standalone category, but instead as an integral part of the production and productivity process. It's through making things that we learn how they can be made better, which is why the most productive companies also tend to be the most innovative. And that's why in creating, for example, the arsenal of democracy in World War II, Washington turned first to the commercial automobile and electronics companies because they had the most engineers and therefore could be counted on to do things and make things better, even if they had never made them before. For example, when engineers at Pontiac turned their attention to producing the 20-millimeter Oerlikon anti-aircraft gun, they completely redesigned the product to make it faster and also better. And as a result, they managed to cut production time per gun from 3.5 hours to 15 minutes. Now, there are other examples that are contained in my written testimony. The point is, innovation follows productivity, not the other way around. Another principle that animated the arsenal of democracy was that it was threat-based, not capability-based. The Germans and Japanese made it very plain what was needed from the beginning: the tools to beat the U-boat, the Japanese Zero and the Me-109 and the German Panzer. One of the problems I think we face today is that the focus has been on the capabilities of high-end technologies like AI and quantum, rather than on the enemy they're supposed to deal with. One could argue that hypersonics is an exception, But this is largely because we sense that we've fallen behind Russia and China in that technology, just as we were behind Germany and Japan when we entered World War II. In short, by focusing on the threat first and foremost, we make for a better and more innovative industrial base. 2 points in conclusion. Given the themes of my book and all the issues and problems confronting our defense industrial base today, people constantly ask me, could we do it again? My answer is yes, but not alone. Instead, in addition to restoring our base whenever and wherever possible, we need to build a global industrial network with trusted allies, the UK and the Five Eyes, NATO members, Japan and South Korea, especially in the advanced technologies like AI, quantum, and space, but also in the traditional and conventional technologies like shipbuilding and like energetics, in other words, the next generation munitions, in which the Chinese are already surging ahead. I call this the arsenal of democracies for the 21st century. And like its 20th century predecessor, it can also overwhelm what I've been identifying as the new axis since 2015, China, Russia, and Iran. And overwhelm them with democracy's innovative output. Consider this. Today, the United States and its world's most advanced tech countries, 18 of the top 20 are democracies. China, by contrast, ranks 32nd on the list, while Russia and Iran don't even score. All this indicates that if the US and democracies band together, they can overpower China and the new axis with a kind of high-tech focus that's the core of a winning and innovative arsenal of democracies. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention that Colonel Gunzinger has more than 3,000 hours in the B-52. I just try not to give too much credit to West Pointers and Air Force guys, so that is my bias, but I apologize. So, Colonel Gunzinger, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you very much for asking us to come testify today. We're now at a point where urgent action is needed to ensure our armed forces will have the technological advantage over the pacing threat. I agree that history should inform this effort, and I'm going to offer 6 lessons that I learned and used as a force development planner in the Air Force and an OSD as a DASD. My first point is maintaining a technological advantage is a marathon, not a destination. By that, I mean we should treat defense innovation as a series of sustained competitions. History teaches us it's a mistake to think that technological breakthroughs will give our military an enduring advantage. Technologies we developed during the late Cold War period, like PGMs, stealth, information networks, leapfrogged our military over adversaries, and we saw that during Operation Desert Storm. However, China and other competitors have studied our military successes and have developed capabilities and operating concepts to offset them. So technological inferiority is a very real possibility if our military does not continuously modernize, and we cannot treat innovation as episodic and driven by crises. Second, we should seek asymmetric advantages rather than parity, and that means DoD should prioritize new capabilities that will disrupt and impose costs on enemies instead of simply fighting a better war of attrition. Now, that's exactly what DoD's Assault Breaker Initiative did when it created a reconnaissance strike complex Andy referred to in the 1980s to counter a Warsaw Pact threat that could field more combat capacity in Central Europe than NATO. So today we're facing a similar challenge with PLA forces that will have time, distance, and combat mass advantages over our military in a Western Pacific conflict. So our services must pursue breakthrough technologies that will fundamentally change the rules of the game, instead of trying to match the PLA warship for warship, aircraft for aircraft, and weapon for weapon. Third, new technologies are only as effective as the way they are used. History has shown us that groundbreaking technologies are most effective when they are matched with operational concepts that are designed to take advantage of their attributes. When Predator drones first joined the force in the 1990s, they were restricted to ISR missions. They're glorified artillery spotters. But when they are modified to carry weapons, it opened up an entirely new approach to using sensor shooters for precision strikes. So as new technologies like uncrewed CCAs are fielded, our military should develop concepts for using them in ways that will disrupt and degrade the operations of opposing forces instead of simply improving how we plan to operate today. My fourth and fifth points are capacity matters. Innovation will only make a difference if you procure new technologies at scale. So even as we invest in technologies to offset China's combat mass advantage, numbers matter. An aircraft, ship, tank, you name it, can only be at one place at one time. So in the 1990s and 2000s, many in DoD saw increases in weapon system effectiveness as justification to slash force structure, which is part of the reason why our forces are now too small to meet their global requirements. So the solution really is to acquire new technologies at the scale needed to deter and defeat our nation's enemies, and that will require sustained, predictable budget growth. And finally, new technologies will require trained and experienced personnel in volume to use them. DoD must have enough personnel with adequate levels of training to fully exploit the advantages that two new technologies will offer. History has taught us that when two opposing forces have relatively equal technologies, the side with the best trained personnel often has the advantage. It's common sense. So, fielding new technologies and training personnel to use them, that goes hand in hand. And this is incredibly important today, given that it now takes years to develop highly trained, experienced airmen, sailors, soldiers, and Marines. And like new technologies, we're not going to have the time to surge their training and give them the kind of experience they need in the midst of a peer-on-peer conflict. And with that, I thank you again. I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you all. I am an unabashed fan of military reading lists, and a lot of your books have appeared on military reading lists, and it's Christmas time, and we're all looking for books to give. Imagine you are able to assign holiday reading to the Secretary of Defense, or rather just assign a case study of military innovation that you think it is particularly important for the Secretary of Defense to understand. What would that be and why? We'll start with you, Dr. Krepinevich. You can't assign your own book, sorry.
Can't assign your own books.
That's why I said case study.
I would, I guess one of the books I would assign would be Dr. Herman's book on Freedom's Forge. Because you can really, in reading that book, get a clear understanding of just how different things were then relative to the way they are now, and just how much effort and what kind of organization went into creating the Arsenal Democracy or Freedom's Forge. So that would be a book I would recommend. A case study I would recommend would be Nick Lambert's book, Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution. Basically, it talked about how the world's global power at the turn of the 20th century, Great Britain, was challenged by a rising power in the form of Germany. So there's a similarity there. You know, we're the dominant power, China's the rising power. And Britain faced a number of what I would call operational challenges. So it was how to protect the empire, how to protect commerce throughout the empire, commerce to an island. There were military technologies that were advancing at a rapid rate. Submarines were being introduced, torpedoes, undersea communications cables, wireless. So you have this combination of a country that's lost its lead in some critical areas of the military competition, as we've experienced, but also this raft of new technologies, global commitments. So I think the Fisher Revolution, as Lambert calls it, Sir John Fisher's Naval Revolution, would be a good case study.
Dr. Herman, and you're not allowed to recommend one of his books. No, you're not allowed to, sorry. We'll just assume you would have, in the interest of time.
Talk button, don't I? If that is so, then what I will do is mention, I think, two titles that I think bear on the long view with regard to these issues, particularly, if you like, on the political and economic background within which these sort of patterns of disruptive innovation take place. Andy mentioned Nick Lambert's book. I'll mention another Lambert, Andrew Lambert, and his book on maritime states, which is about the evolution of sea power over the centuries and the way in which economic factors and economies and societies become seedbeds for innovation, not just in the military, but also innovation in broader developments of technological progress, of democracy, of a whole range of other areas that I think needs to be part of the wider context in which we think about this. Then I'm going to recommend another book. This is by an economist by the name of Adam Tooze. It's called The Wages of Destruction, The Making and the Breaking of the Nazi Economy. And I mention this because that book, too, is about disruptive innovation. In this case, of how Germany's or Hitler's grand designs for dominating Europe and for creating a Europe dominated by a master race had the disruptive effects on the economy and made it really impossible for Germany to sustain the kind of war effort that it eventually found itself drawn into. And some of the statistics and the discussion there about the impact of military strategy on the German economy on the one hand, and then on the limitations of that German economy on the way in which the Nazis were able to wage war here is, I think, has a lot of great insights that I'd recommend it for reading.
Colonel Gunzinger, in less than 30 seconds.
Absolutely. I hesitate to offer one book. Andrew's Seven Deadly Snares is pretty good. You didn't say I couldn't mention him. But there are a number of books written about the interwar period between World War I and World War II. There was a great ferment of generation of new ideas for amphibious warfare, island hopping, strategic bombing, mechanized warfare, written not just by U.S. authors, of course, but by German authors as well. And that was a fantastic period that reshaped how we conducted warfare for decades. So I think it's well worth investigating some of those.
I will wrap all these up and send them to Lloyd Austin. So, Mr. Kana.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about how we think about the innovation of DARPA versus innovation in battle. So obviously DARPA gave us Siri, the drones, GPS, internet, the mouse that all propelled a lot of the Silicon Valley innovation. Have those innovations significantly helped us also in our military capability? And is there something about DARPA that has allowed disruptive innovation in a way that we aren't doing the disruptive innovation militarily when it comes to fighting, or are we doing it in the same way? Dr. Krepinevich?
Dr. Krepinevich, thank you. I've done some work with DARPA. One of the great advantages DARPA has is it's unfettered in the sense that it has a lot of freedom to maneuver. I would say that from my perspective, one of the challenges that you have with any innovation is whether a military service will adopt it in terms of a new technology or a new technique. A lot of times that will rise or fall on whether or not it sort of fits what a military considers to be its institutional needs. And so if DARPA is offering to the military something that will enable it to do something that it likes to do, enable it to do it better, enable it to increase its budget share, that's something I think that will increase the odds of DARPA having a success. The question is whether the military, its institutional preferences are actually well aligned with the country's strategic and security needs. And so, for example, I'll give you an example from history. The U.S. Army, trying to introduce tanks and armor units in the 1930s, still had its cavalry arm arguing that horses could do just as good a job. And in fact, in some of the field exercises, they actually moved horses around the battlefield on trucks and then unloaded them off the trucks, and then they went about their business. So a lot of times it's whether there's a receptive home, and a lot of times it's whether the military has figured out how they're going to fight. Again, what is their operational concept? Another example would be the Germans in Blitzkrieg. The Germans figured out that they not only needed tanks, but they needed tanks with certain design parameters. So they wanted tanks that had long range and could move fast. And they were willing to trade defense in terms of armor plate and gunnery, firepower, in order to get that, because their vision of war was not to go back to World War I and fight trench warfare. It was to break through the trench lines and get so far beyond the trenches, okay, speed and range, that the Allies couldn't reform that trench line, that they would break into their rear. So again, a lot depends on this relationship between how, what kind of technology is emerging and the extent to which it fits the military's vision about what's the future of warfare.
I guess the paradox for me is that when it comes to spawning disruptive innovation, the military has been way ahead of the commercial sector. I mean, the reality is, Steve Jobs, all these folks, they went and they saw the technology that DARPA and NSF had created. And yet when it comes to the adoption of that very technology, it seems like they're slower than the private sector.
Well, it's, okay, very quickly, if you look at the period between the world wars, as Colonel Gunzinger was saying, it's been called the aviation mechanization radio revolution, because those were the sinews of the carrier task force and Blitzkrieg. Those were all developed. The leading arm of that was in the commercial sector. And the military has adopted it or failed to adopt it based upon how they viewed these technologies supporting their vision of how they wanted to fight war. Some were very innovative. Some were, like the French, for example, always our favorite example, basically sought to improve how they fought in a sense marginally, as opposed to looking at an entirely new way of waging war at a much more effective level. And you can see this in the commercial sector, where you have these big innovations that you pointed out, which really lead to a different kind of product. And if there's a book to be recommended there, is Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma.
Thank you.
Mr. Lalota.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses for being with us here today. I represent New York's 1st Congressional District, the eastern end of Long Island, a couple of hours outside of Manhattan. My district includes Hauppauge, the nation's 2nd largest industrial park outside of Silicon Valley. And more broadly, Long Island, the greater region, is home to 167 defense and aerospace companies comprising over 3 million square feet of industrial and commercial space, with over 10,000 full-time employees and $3 billion of economic activity. And as was noted in some of your opening testimony, with the decline of domestic industrial defense contractors, it's important to recognize and promote the existing ones, specifically where I'm from, Long Island's industrial defense industry, whose contributions help to keep our nation's military the greatest the world has ever known. With that in mind, and for any or all three of you, from a warfighting capability development perspective, what can our government learn from our partners in the private sector who are constantly working on the next generation of machinery and technology? Colonel, you seem like you might want to lean into that one.
Yes, I think we can, our military can learn quite a bit. I've noticed in my time when I was on the air staff, then OSD, when a chief of service or a senior leader, military or civilian, wanted to know about next generation technologies, they usually called their own labs. Oftentimes I've found that there is a better answer out in the defense industry, out in the commercial world. And having the ability to reach out and understand what is being developed, what is the maturity of that technology, and how that could be adapted to address many of the challenges our military faces is critically important. It's both a push-pull. Industry needs to have pathways to the government to inform, hey, this is what we've done. We think this can help. But our military needs to pull as well. They've got to be open to asking instead of just looking at their own labs. That's critically important.
In your mind, is that communication, is that collaboration happening at the right level right now?
Increasingly, yes. Enough, no. And that's why I'm a huge fan of things like war games, which will bring in industry along with operators and planners and strategists, maybe even a couple budget people, and get them together to deal with kind of an operational problem and say, and here people say, hey, you know, we have a new technology that can do this. We didn't know that. Can you produce that over next? Yes, we can. It's that kind of a dialogue that can really help inform our planners and lead to the creation of requirements, which will then lead to actual combat capabilities.
And I think I would add this, too, that I think one of the other important ingredients for this kind of interaction and dialogue is including more of the warfighters directly into the discussion. Instead of treating, well, either senior command or the offices of the secretary or other agencies to be intermediaries between industry and warfighters. Bring the warfighters in, show them what the capabilities are. Let them see, let them make suggestions, and I think a lot of very interesting and exciting things will start to happen, even with very small companies as well as with the largest.
I think one thing certainly that I would suggest the military learn from the private sector is the ability to compete based on time. Another book you might check into is George Stalk's book, Time-Based Competition. If you can move faster than your competition, you can adapt more quickly. Colonel Boyd mentioned it as getting inside their decision loop. But you know, look at the if you want to look at time-based competition, look at the American Navy in the period leading up to World War II. They created the industrial base that enabled them to outproduce the Japanese, you know, basically more quickly because you had a bigger base and a more adaptive base. If you look at the British, they pursued what was called the first and the second move advantage. If you can let your adversary move first, which was what the British did in the 19th century, because you can move faster than they can, then you see all their plans exposed. You know what direction they're going in. So your uncertainty about how to respond to them is much, much lower if you can move faster than they can. And that's why the British, even though they had the world's best Navy, let the French go first in developing steam propulsion and first in terms of ironclad ships, two major innovations. And the British said, go first. We're not going to obsolete our own wooden ships until you go first. And once they did, the British outbuilt them.
And what we're seeing now is the Chinese have learned how to do that, taking technologies that we developed and using them and scaling them in ways that will make them incredibly effective militarily. We need to reverse that process.
Thank you. I yield.
Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I sit here thinking back to the future and advanced research and the technology that's involved, a disturbing thought I've always had, and I don't know what we could do, are we missing things, but let's assume some of the greatest threats we have are small terrorist threats. They could be non-state actors, or they can be proxies for major competition actors. And with AI, they can take biochemicals at very limited cost, with only a handful of people doing it, and kill millions of people. So as we're looking at all the technological things that have to happen, technology working at some more basic types of threats that we have present a real problem. Do you see us concentrating and researching what we can do around something like that? Just AI to biochemical warfare, millions of people are dead. It costs maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars and only a few people. And it's an awful thought I have, but as we're looking at our greatest threats, sometimes are we missing some of these things? Because we're in a race, a technological race.
And in my book, The Origins of Destruction, looking at the various technologies, there are oftentimes sections called the democratization of destruction, and it relates to your point, Congressman. So, for example, we see today in the Middle East, Hezbollah, Hamas, they have rockets. They have rockets that can fire at extended ranges. If you want to talk about a disruptive shift in the character of the competition, what happens when these rockets and missiles get precision guidance? Again, it's the cost equation is not in favor of the Israelis when it comes to missile defense against precision weapons. They can use AI and algorithms to detect when these missiles are going to land in an area that they're concerned about or when they're going to land out in the middle of nowhere. If you look at the biosciences, a group of Canadian scientists from scratch and $100,000 engineered horsepox, just sort of resurrected it. $100,000, that's not a lot. And, you know, you get a few intelligent scientists, you can do some terrifying things, arguably, these days. Look at additive manufacturing. We're worried about additive manufacturing, people printing handguns. What will additive manufacturing allow these kinds of groups and organizations to print out in another 10 or 15 years? So there are, and certainly in terms of artificial intelligence, there are arguments to be made that spear phishing, in terms of basically malware and so on, is going to be much more easier to generate using artificial intelligence. And the question is, well, are defenses against that going to be enabled by artificial intelligence? So in a number of ways, it looks as though the trends in technology are not only going to enable militaries, you know, standing militaries to operate more effectively, but non-state groups to pose more challenging problems for us as well.
Now, let me add that back during the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review, which I helped lead a team for the Secretary of Defense to perform that review, we looked at a number of disruptive threats, bioterror, cruise missile attacks on the continental United States from cargo ships. We didn't really look at AI and so forth at the time. But the problem was people are willing to say, this is a challenge. We must do something. We need to invest in analyses to figure out what's the best approach to dealing with this challenge should it ever happen. But when it comes to actually spending resources to counter them or prepare for them, they're not there, because there are other requirements that the militaries have established that, frankly, eat up the trade space, eat up the budget. And they're valid requirements. I'm not criticizing that. But when it comes to resources, my point is it's often not available to deal with those kinds of threats, which could kick off the next conflict. And we might not even have thought about what that threat could be yet.
Yeah, just in closing, I think that sometimes we're caught up in the major power competition to the extent that we're not looking at what some of the more realistic threats could be in that regard. And I think that's a mistake. I think if we're taking away from our ability in the intelligence area to try and scope out some of these things, get the information, be able to prevent it, perhaps so much of our resources go into this competition, we might miss what was the most realistic and dangerous threat of all. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Herman, in your witness testimony, you described the decline of the U.S. domestic industrial capacity and workforce, both defense and non-defense. Over the decades, you described the defense industrial base workforce as neglected in terms of national security strategy. Could you elaborate on the neglect and provide the recommendations you may have on how to incorporate workforce as part of our national strategy? And this may be as comprehensive as contracting versus appropriations versus all the inefficiencies that we as Congress are a big part of. How could we streamline that and make it better?
Hit my button. I think it's an excellent question. It's one that I've been spending a good deal of my time more and more. In fact, right now I'm heading up a commission on workforce development for the space industry, which I think has enormous implications for not only for our future economy, but also for future national security issues. And I think that the challenge that we face with regard to workforce, which, by the way, we faced in World War II as well. You know, there were a lot more plants and shipyards opening during World War II than there were workers available. And this became a major problem of how to recruit and how to train and how to retain workers in that environment, particularly when you had a free market wage environment where if you were working in a defense plant in Detroit and you heard that in the Kaiser shipyards they were paying a lot more, plus you had health benefits, you could just pack up and go. There was no one who was going to say, no, you have to stay and keep working on what you've been doing here with regard to producing tank treads or whatever else came up. So you've got the training and development, you've got workforce, you've got education issues, which we always keep coming back to, the question about K-12 and STEM education and the constant shortfall that we have in terms of both development of skill sets, but also in updating the curriculum in those areas here. We've been talking about this for decades, and yet the trend is still downhill. So what I'm hoping we'll be able to do with the work that we're doing on the Space Workforce Commission at Hudson is to come up with some answers, to come up with a paradigm about ways in which we can expand workforce, in ways that it can be a paradigm for talking about it with the rest of the defense industrial base, but then also for our own manufacturing economy as a whole. But I think part of the issue has been that this has always been an afterthought, particularly on the part of military planners and strategists. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think part of it is, if you like, I'm going to say this, I think part of it too is a class issue. I think there has always been a reluctance to think about the blue-collar aspects of our defense industrial base, of our manufacturing base as a whole, and to think about it as something which will always be there when it's needed, instead of something that needs to be revivified and has to be taken a new direction for the 21st century. And that includes, of course, our work with foreign countries and with foreign workers as well. And part of my vision for an arsenal of democracies will be to think about the issue of workforce and the ways in which U.S. workers from our leading democracies can, in fact, find a way to work together and to become part of a productive whole with those systems which are going to be most important to the future of our national defense.
Thank you. In regards, I only have a short amount of time, but Mr. I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Krepinevich?
Close.
Good. As far as lessons learned from the war in Ukraine with Russia and innovating for the future, do you think it's more important to focus on innovations and technologies versus tactics and surge capabilities when we're talking about not just any war, but looking into the future for lessons learned?
I think the answer is both. I think we need to look at how both sides are using technologies. There's, of course, a lot of discussion about the use of drones in that environment and how they've used them. I think in terms of operations, though, you look at what the Russians have done in particular recently in terms of defenses. And a lot of these defenses are very formidable against even modern weapons. And they aren't especially sophisticated when you just put in enormous numbers of landmines to stop someone. So a strong lessons, and that's been a characteristic of military innovation over time. After World War I, the Germans lost, and they spent several years looking at what went wrong, both from a technological perspective and an operational perspective.
If I may say something quickly about, can I?
Go for it.
About the Russian industrial base, defense industrial base. You know, what is amazing is that as an industrial base, it's probably one of the least innovative of the major powers. It has been one which is really dependent upon export sales in order to sustain itself. And yet what's interesting is that you have a very uninnovative defensive base, which has managed to sustain this war effort for over these last 2 years. I mean, it's an incredible story of how being able to outlast your enemy and outproduce them, even when your resources there aren't really a cutting edge and aren't really sort of moving the military technology paradigm forward.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you. You spoke a little bit about the British approach with the French and shipbuilding, and alluded to China following this similar tactic more recently. I guess a two-part question for any of you. Are there, part one, examples where the U.S. has either willfully or out of necessity taken a similar approach? And part two, would you advocate that the U.S. look at a similar approach today in any instances, or do you think that would assume too much risk?
Just a couple of general observations. Since the mid-19th century, warfare has moved from 2 domains to 8. Speed, range, and accuracy have enabled forces operating in each of these 8 domains to influence operations in the other 7. So when you sit down and you try and figure out, how am I going to defend the first island chain, you have a lot of choices, but you also have a lot of uncertainty, because you don't know what is just the exact right mix of these kinds of capabilities and what attributes they have to enable you to maximize your effectiveness. So because this level of uncertainty is so high, the ability to experiment and exercise with a wide range of capabilities becomes very important to find out, again, to reduce uncertainty at the margins. You know, what capabilities work, what don't, what attributes should they have, and the ability to adapt quickly as you find out what works and what doesn't. This issue of time-based competition, you know, time is a resource. You know, budgets are resources, technologies are resources, people are resources. Well, so is time. And the side that figures out first how to operate most effectively, knowing that they're not going to get it perfect, but there's going to be some error, but that does it better than the other side. And then once the balloon goes up, as they say, and you start to see what works and what doesn't, who can move more quickly than the other to feel those capabilities that actually matter more, that's the side that's going to have an innovative advantage.
And can I say something here with regard to those range of choices and the range of domains? This is another role for artificial intelligence, by the way, is in the area what we call strategic reasoning. In other words, helping planners and strategists work out what's the best combination of priorities involved in a multi-domain conflict, which we're going to have more and more of that as a possibility, but also a multi-front. What happens if you're involved in a conflict in the Middle East, in the Taiwan Straits, and in Central or Eastern Europe all at once? Well, artificial intelligence, and I would also add quantum computing, provide the kind of modeling and the kind of analysis, optimization analysis that will allow planners to get through and understand and have a range of feasible choices, as opposed to having to sort of grope their way through the possibilities that go with it. Yet another example where, again, the disruptive innovation in this case can be really important at the very top, as well as what happens on the battlefield or what happens in an industrial base.
I would caution, because we can do something technologically doesn't mean we should. And because an adversary is doing something doesn't necessarily mean we should follow suit. When I was in OSD policy as a DASD, I often heard policy people, very smart individuals, talk about, well, look, China is imposing costs on us because they're fielding these medium range, intermediate range, ballistic missiles that can attack our bases along our first island, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We should do the same to them. Well, not necessarily. They have a very different target set than we would. They're attacking bases, our bases and our allies' bases that are undefended. They're not hardened. We can't disperse yet because we don't have the resources to do it. We lack kinetic and non-kinetic defenses, whereas China's, the PLA Air Force, very different kinds of targets, very different. Their bases are hardened. They're ready to disperse. They have decoys, et cetera. That takes a different mix of weapons, a different mix of capabilities to attack effectively. So as an operator, you have to think through those differences to establish requirements that will make us the most effective against them, rather than just say, well, we should do what they're doing.
Mr. Luttrell.
Dr. Herman, button, got it. Forgot my button too. You mentioned artificial intelligence, strategic advantages, machine learning, and how that gives us an operational strategic advantage over our enemies. I got to tell you, I don't know an AI computer that's ever been shot at. And when a round goes down range, it has your name on it, and it's hollering at you, things change. I think my question is, So we push for this industrial footprint. Colonel, you rattled off about a half dozen issues that we're facing in the country that push us way to the rear. You know, and I don't know if I could, it may be a fair assessment to say the Iraq and Afghani war may have pushed us to the rear because we were front sight focused on that engagement while our adversaries took our inventions and ran with them, and now they're that far ahead of us. The one thing then, the majority of my colleagues sitting on this panel with me served in combat, and the one thing that you can't argue is a fighter on the ground with his or her finger on the trigger, period. I mean, one of the most formidable forces I fought against was the Afghanis, and they've been fighting their whole lives, and they love every second of it, and I don't think they've ever lost a war, if I remember correctly. We hear in the committees up here all the time about how we need to advance the technological space in order to defeat our adversaries. Doctor, you mentioned that it needs to be weighed accordingly. Does the Hudson Institute, is their stance more in the technological space in order to combat China, Iran, or do you have an opinion on are we losing our footprint with the forces, and how does that play out? Anybody?
Well, I think that's one of the key issues that we're not impaneled right now to talk about, but it's the big question, isn't it? I mean, you can equip your people with all of the advanced technologies you want and back them up with those technologies, the whole works, unmanned systems, AI, space, and all that. But are they ready to go into combat? Are they ready, and are they dedicated enough, and are they willing to risk their lives for what is coming? And one of the things that concerns me is that the cost of the United States being the leading superpower of the free world is a heavy one. It's a heavy one in human terms as well as economic terms and technology terms. And all of this, in my view, all of this discussion that we've been having here is moot if we don't have a commitment on the part of Americans and our allies, but particularly Americans, because people look to America to lead. We don't have a commitment to defend freedom to the last measure. And that is still going to be the most fundamental advantage we have against any opponent we face, against any scenario, war or war-fighting scenario, deterrent scenario we have. We need to make the sacrifice that those and you and others made and were willing to make. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time.
The battle forces that we fought alongside, the biggest, one of the largest statements that they ever made is like, USOBs, y'all volunteer to fight. It's in your blood. We don't have to do that where we're from. They make us do it. But you guys...
At one of the hearings after the first Gulf War, I think it was General Powell was asked, would you have basically traded your troops for the Iraqi troops or your equipment for the Iraqi equipment? And Powell said, I'd trade my equipment, take theirs, but I'm not going to trade my troops for theirs. And there's an old saying about Bear Bryant that he'd take his'n and beat urine, and then he'd take urine and beat his'n. And so leadership, the quality of troops, it counts for an enormous amount. That said, technology counts too, because...
It does, but there comes a point in time, and I'm not arguing the fact I'm a tech guy, but there was a point in time later on in the war that you couldn't drop a bomb. You couldn't fly the plane over the top of us to help us out. You could do none of that. And I know that with the advances in AI, a push of a button is a very valuable threat to everybody that has the advancements ahead of us. I just wanted to get your opinion on that.
Well,
Chairman,
two quick points about AI. I worked a lot in missile defense, and there's a point at which if you're, say, an air defense battery, you're going to be overrun. And you can't figure out, and same thing if you're in a carrier strike group. You know, how do you defend against all the stuff coming in? How do you prioritize it? And how do you sustain it? If it's a sustained attack over 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, a human being's mind starts to go to jello. Same thing with a pilot that had to be tanked twice to get from the Arabian Gulf to Afghanistan. on these 8, 10, 12 hours. After about 8 hours, a pilot's mind starts to go to jello. You can only keep your keen sense of being on the fighting edge for so long. And in those cases, artificial intelligence, in the form of a drone, might be the answer.
Mr. DeLuzio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and hello, everyone. Focus my questions on defense industrial base, consolidation there, and impacts on innovation. And so, look, with the consolidation that's happened since the 90s is obvious. It's pretty drastic. The primes have gone from 51 to 5 in that time frame. We've seen consolidation impact the number of bids from everything from weapon systems, components, parts, you name it. Senior leadership at the Pentagon, civilian and uniform, has raised the alarm. I think my colleagues in both parties on this committee and subcommittee have expressed different concerns around the impact of consolidation on readiness and otherwise. Oftentimes we focus on, and I've talked about, us as the public overpaying for weapon systems, the industrial base's ability to deliver on time. The Wall Street Journal today or yesterday talked about the inability to surge excess or extra capacity. My question, though, is about the impact on innovation. Has this decrease in competition hurt the industrial base's ability to innovate? Is it too hard for smaller, newer entrants to come in and compete? So I open the floor to all three of you. Dr. Krepinevich, start with you. How are you seeing this decrease in competition impact innovation?
Well, obviously, the more primes you have, the more opportunity you have for competitive bidding and for different ideas as to how to meet a particular need of the militaries. I would also say that when it comes to innovation, a big part of what the industrial base can also do is respond to a military sense of how it plans to fight. I keep coming back to this. Until we decide how we're going to defend the first island chain, it becomes very difficult to know what we're going to ask of the industrial base. The other point is not just with respect to innovation, but in this context, and I'll go back to the some of the lessons of previous periods of disruptive innovation. The British were very keen to maintain an industrial base that could outproduce its rivals and do it more quickly. So that was a key metric for the British when they looked at their industrial base. Can we produce at scale more quickly than our rivals? The other issue that came out in one of the cases was with respect to the American Navy prior to World War II. Didn't quite know, whether carriers were going to be the answer. Didn't even know what kind of carriers. So they built different classes of carriers. They built small carriers, big, carriers, Goldilocks carriers. Same thing. We didn't quite know what the best form of air attack was going to be. What was the best form of strike? They built horizontal bombers that, again, dropped bombs vertically. They built dive bombers. They built torpedo bombers. And then they had the industrial base. Again, you had to have a fairly broad industrial base, be able to produce that faster and larger quantities than our adversaries could do in order to keep up with us.
Well, I would say that, from my point of view, and and also from a World War II point of view, by comparison, yes, there certainly are lost opportunities when you have reduced competition and when you have fewer numbers of primes, as Andrew was just saying. But I think it operates, the issue operates in a slightly more subtle way, and that is that what I would see is even bigger obstacle, both to innovation but also to a really productive and scalable industrial base, is FARC, is just the federal regulation and the enormous labyrinth and the hoops that companies have to jump through in order to negotiate that. And what you've ended up with then, with regard to the big contractors, are the ones who can negotiate that labyrinth and who have become, know how to work the system in ways in which so many other companies, including mid-size and startup, and even commercial companies who would love to be involved, love to help out and bring their technology and their ideas and their products to our national defense, who simply take a look at the size of the federal regulations and say there's no possible way. Well, we've been here before. in 1940, December of 1940, the U.S. Army decided they need a light utility vehicle, right, a new one. And they sent out, with a range of specifications, they sent out a request for proposals to 286 companies in America. 2 of them answered. None of the big companies, not Ford, not Packard, none of them, General Motors, none of them answered because none of them wanted to do any business with the federal government. They knew it was a loss leader. They didn't want to get involved with it. The 2 who answered, one of them, Bantam, was about to go bankrupt. And it was like, we'll just roll the dice one last time. We've never made anything like this, but what the hell. The other one was Willis. And it was, of course, the Willis Jeep model that came out of that. It was almost by happenstance because those 2 companies were thinking, like, we don't want to get involved with the federal government, but we have to. Their backs were to the wall, and that's why that's why they did it. What we really need and what we're working on, what is happening in places like the PPBE Reform Commission, with which I've been working over this last year, one of the things we need to do is to find ways to ease in and continue the involvement of small companies, of startup companies with great ideas and great technologies, and to enable them to reach the point where they become part of programs of record and part of the mainstream with it. There, I think, even more than trying to change the balance between the big primes and the smaller players and the competition issue, that's where the thrust is going to have to come.
Thank you. Mr. Fallon.
Just piggybacking on what you were saying before, invention sometimes comes to pass because it is necessary, like World War I, and we saw a lot of the things that came out of that, and how to use the airplane. We didn't really know how to use it. It was there, but it was in its infancy. And then same thing with World War II. I wonder how long it would have taken to develop nuclear weapons if World War II had never, it's kind of counterfactual history, alternate history, but it was kind of a necessity at the time, and the race was on between us and the Germans, and then Yom Kippur in '73. You see a lot of what the Soviets were fielding, and then what we were fielding, and then what came out of that, the Abrams, Bradley, Apache, Black Hawk, Patriot systems. So the question really becomes: does DoD want to innovate? And I'm of the humble opinion that nothing will change unless really everything does. So I wanted to ask the 3 of you on the panel. What do you think the role of venture capital can play in the future of innovation? And we'll go with Dr. K first.
Actually, there is I think a room for venture capital. If you look at, and I think this particular period is similar to the interwar period between the world wars, because then most of the technology that was being pulled into military capabilities, aviation, mechanization, radio, was from the commercial sector. If you look at some of the technologies today, artificial intelligence, additive manufacturing, synthetic biology, right on down the line with some exceptions, for example, like directed energy and hypersonics, a lot of that is in the commercial sector. And I'm familiar with one organization, Shield Capital, that has set its mission to identify in the commercial sector those gaps that it sees in the commercial sector that would be useful to the military, and to fund business in those gaps, because they think down the road the military's not only will this be useful in a commercial sense, but ultimately it will be in demand by the military. So I do think there is a role, and historically there has been a role as well.
The process that you were just talking about, that phenomenon, is what I call emergence through emergency. Mm-hmm. And where you suddenly find yourself in a situation where your back is to the wall and you have to think innovatively and differently and come up with a new paradigm. But as our chairman was just saying earlier, we may not have such a time for that kind of reflection and retooling if we find ourselves in a conflict in the Taiwan Straits. This issue about venture capital is one I've thought about a great deal, because I think it is a missing advantage that the United States have. All of that private capital, equity capital, which is looking for opportunities for investment in innovation And a lot of it is, and I think we'll agree, a lot of it is people who are involved, not just in terms of making a profit, but also who do want to support our national security, who become involved in these technologies for patriotic reasons, as well as for return. The challenge is, I think, that we have two different cultures with what happens at DOD and what happens in the venture capital realm. And I think DOD, the department has been looking at ways to encourage more venture capital and bring it on board, setting up offices, et cetera. But I think in some ways, they think of venture capital as substitute capital. In other words, this is money we don't have to spend from our budget because we'll find private investors who will do it. But of course, that's not the case. Venture capitalists are looking for something else. They're looking for return on their investment. They're looking for a long-term fostering of a growth from a technology or a product that has national security uses, but which will ultimately pay off in the commercial realm and is commercializable as well as a national security asset. So I think finding a way in which to bring those two communities together involves bringing a mindset shift on DOD on the one hand, which is venture capitalists can be a useful ally, but they're not thinking the way you do about money and about investment. And on the other side of making venture capital feel like this is we're going to create a investment and an acquisition environment which will be conducive to bringing on your best ideas and your best companies.
Let me jump in very quickly if I could. Yes, DoD must innovate. It knows it must innovate. And to answer the last three questions on a point, but there have to be programs that offer VCs opportunities. There has to be opportunities for different companies to actually fund development of technologies that will lead to innovation. During the Cold War period, our Air Force bought a new type combat aircraft, one every 2 years. After the Cold War, it was one new aircraft every decade. Now, that's not the kind of promise that VCs are going to pony up money for to fund technologies that can lead to new aircraft. And that also hurts the workforce because they want to work on programs that are going to succeed and actually end up in the field in warfighters' hands. So VCs have a role, but they must have some promise on return, and that's going to take new capabilities like CCAs, collaborative combat aircraft, which we see VC money pouring into different companies, coming up with new ideas for this family of CCAs, because there's some promise of actual programs and actual return.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a lot of difference between SpaceX and NASA, I think, in a lot of ways, too, but necessity. All right, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I want to ask another question, which means you all will have an opportunity to ask another round if you want. Just let us know if you can get in the queue. Dr. K, describe to me your recommendation for a national training center, potentially in collaboration with some of our closest allies.
To put this in context, I think if I were Defense Secretary, one of the short list of questions I would ask is, tell me how you're going to defend the first island chain. And during the Cold War, we had a set of operational concepts that said, this is how we're going to defend NATO. The Army and the Air Force developed something called air-land battle that described not only how to stop the Soviet advance, but also how to conduct deep strike operations to break up the second and third wave coming out of Eastern Europe. The Navy said, we're going to keep Soviet submarines north of the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to send our submarines up there. We're very good at submarine warfare. We're going to keep their bombers from coming down and bombing our transport ships trying to get across the Atlantic by something called the outer air battle. And there was this chainsaw concept they had as part of that. The Marines said, we're not going to let them flank our troops in Germany by coming into Norway. And so the Marines pre-positioned equipment in Norway. They moved in the plan was to move in very quickly, seize the airfields, keep the Russians from getting to the airfields. We have nothing like that with respect to how you're going to defend the first island chain. When I was the special assistant to the Defense Secretary for Special Projects during the Cold War, we had multiple mobilization scenarios what is our mobilization scenario for a Chinese military buildup in the Western Pacific? We looked at least 3 different contingencies with the Soviets, and we learned lessons from that. One of the lessons was we put 4 entire division sets of equipment in West Germany because we knew we couldn't match them unless we flew the troops in and not all the equipment with them. So the idea is what are the operational concepts for defending the Western Pacific, the first island chain? When I wrote Archipelagic Defense, to give you an example to set up the issue of exercises, I said, well, one way we might defend some of these islands is what I call turtle defenses, basically taking the lessons of what the Japanese did in World War II, basically going underground. And in fact, when the Marines hit Iwo Jima in World War II, one Marine said the Japanese aren't on Iwo Jima, they're under in Iwo Jima. So would that work? Is that a viable concept? And this is where you get to the issue of exercises. In the 1970s, we pioneered high-fidelity training, getting back to the earlier question about how well trained are your troops. And we established an opposing force. Back then, it was the Soviets. Where is that kind of training center today? Where is the training center that says, here comes the People's Liberation Army, they're waging systems destruction warfare, they're invading your island. How are you going to defend it successfully? Until you come up with an answer to that, how do you establish defense priorities? What do how can you say this is what we ought to buy? And this is, this is a wasting asset here. This might have been good in counterinsurgency or Desert Storm, but it's not going to be very helpful against the Chinese in defending an island along the chain. And so this, I've talked to, for example, Australians. The Australians say we got a lot of land in Australia. We could develop a combined training center in Australia. You could instrument it. We could develop a combined, Chinese opposing force, just the way we did during the Cold War. Where is this? Exercises not only reduce uncertainty by helping you find out what works and what doesn't, it also builds up support. So, for example, the Brits, their big problem around the turn of the century were submarines and torpedoes. The way they went to war was they would blockade the enemy's naval base. Well, now you can't do that because these people are firing torpedoes at you. Well, what's the answer? Part of the answer was conducting these kinds of exercises so the British naval officers and establishment realized they couldn't operate that way anymore. That's the first step to realizing innovation. And the other example I'll mention would be the German field exercises in the fall of 1937, where they actually had a Panzer division for the first time, this armor division. And it just blew everybody's socks off. I mean, they just couldn't believe what this division was doing in the field. And that's not something you can replicate with a war game or with a study. It's visceral. And so the need for these kinds of exercises, I think, is crucial.
Yeah. I'm out of time. Ranking member, do you have any more questions? Anybody? I have one more then. Sorry. Hey, rank has its privileges. Dr. Herman, your comments about, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but it seemed to be that like innovation it can't be its own separate thing. It needs to be part of like everything going on. It made me think of Elting Morrison's famous book, Men, Machines, in Modern Time, where she talks about innovation is often just iterative, but it also involves like unique human beings with unique personalities. At times, these are like very, the type of human beings that would not necessarily get promoted in the military, right? John Boyd was mentioned earlier, right? I mean, that's probably a great example of it. I guess what I'm driving at is, we talk about innovation, we talk about like, the org chart of DOD, we talk about funding, but ultimately I think it comes down to like a cultural issue of are we promoting and empowering humans that can take intelligent risk and rewarding them for taking intelligent risk? I don't know what the precise question is there, but maybe you can comment on that, even if it's just to push back on my analysis.
Sure, I think you can probably get excellent comments from everybody here on, on that one. I guess my view would be when I'm thinking about innovation and productivity and production is that you have on the one hand, you have the commercial sector, in which innovation is a necessity in order to compete in the marketplace. You always have to make things better and make things faster and make them cheaper. It's the nature of the business you're in. In the military, I think confronting the issue of innovation is when things go wrong, right? It's when you're in the field and suddenly you realize something is not working, and you've got to try something else. Maybe a new technology, maybe a new tactics, maybe an entire new strategic rethink. This is why so often the winner of the last war becomes the loser of the next, right? World War I, the French and the British. World War II, the French, were looking forward. They were actually looking forward to the German invasion, you know. Yeah. General Gamelin was rubbing his hands with glee when he learned that the Germans were going to attack, because he had thought he had figured out exactly how to beat them based on the experience of the First War, right? Yeah. This is how innovation comes in. So in both cases, you just put your finger on the common factor for both: risk-taking. Yeah. Risk in business, which sometimes leads to failure. Your business goes under, and you start a new one. In the military, I'm going to say in military, defense industrial base, there's risks. Yeah. Projects will fail. One of the great virtues, I think, with DARPA is precisely that. They do know that a lot of their projects are going to fail, and it's understood from the beginning that some of these are just not going to work out. I think the challenge is to bring a similar mindset, an openness to risk, a willingness to embrace failure on the small scale in order to bring about success on the large scale that remains the next big cultural cliff to climb at our current Department of Defense.
Well, let me put a finer point on it and invite your comment, Colonel Gunzinger. I just wonder if John Boyd, who's as much of a Marine Corps hero as an Air Force hero, whether he would have made it past the rank of captain in today's military. Just
probably not.
Yeah.
Although I hear it's pretty easy to make major mistakes.
Is your microphone on?
I apologize. It is now. One of the things we cannot do is turn innovation over to a bureaucracy. We've seen that in the past. We saw DoD establish the Transformation Office during the time Secretary Rumsfeld was in charge. And actually, I took over that office as a DASD. But you turn bureaucracy loose on innovation, and you get anything but, more often than not. That's why we have Rapid Capability Offices, a Strategic Capabilities Office. That's why we have DARPAs, because they work outside the current processes to bring good ideas to the fore, to the operators and planners who hold the money. But there has to be resources and a promise of some transition, and that requires leadership. You have to have leaders saying, I agree, we must take that risk. This is transformational. We need to break through the resistance of current programs and actually put money behind this and fund it. If it doesn't work, I'll take the hit. But I think we need to do this, and that takes leadership.
Final comments on the human dimension from Dr. K.
One is, in each of the four studies, key figures that are leading the innovation have extended tenure. So I'll give you, I was on the Joint Forces Command Advisory Board. Typical tenure for a commander there was a year, maybe two. You can't give somebody a 10-year job and give them 2 years to do it. Yeah. And when General Mattis, he called me in around 2008 and said, you know, Andy, I'm thinking of shutting this down. And part of the conversation was, to really get this to work, what you'd want to do is find a Jim Mattis, give him 3 years at Joint Forces Command. If he was making progress, give him another 3 years, and then fleet him up to Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs for a 4-year tour. That 10-year to see something through. And so it's part of it is identifying these people.
I'm thinking of naval reactors.
Naval reactors,
right?
yeah, certainly Rickover's.
legacy.
General Creech, who headed TAC Air during the Revolution and basically the Air Force, headed TAC Air for 6 years, from 78 to 84, and General Dixon before him was like-minded. Jackie Fisher in the Royal Navy had something called the fish pond, because they were all trying to institutionalize. They realized that after they left, if they hadn't done that, there was going to be a backfill. And in each case, there's this, if you want to know if a military is really engaged in disruptive innovation, there's going to be blood on the streets, okay? Look at the Marine Corps. General Berger, whether he had the right idea or not, you knew he was trying to do something. If you look at, for example, Fisher, I'll just give you the best example. He ends up defending himself in a session, in a series of hearings at the Committee on Imperial Defense, headed by the Prime Minister, because the syndicate of discontent has come out against him, admirals, politicians, and so on. Same thing with the American Navy in the period between the World Wars, knife fights going on, you know, basically between the gun club, the battleship admirals, and the aviation advocates. So people matter. People matter a great deal.
Thank you all. This has been phenomenal. I guess more than anything else, we need our warriors to read and write so that our fighting isn't done by fools, as the old saying goes. And they have a good place to start with all of your testimony and the books you've written that informs it. And this has been a really enriching conversation. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to the ranking member. And with that, the subcommittee hearing is adjourned.